Awesome. Okay, Alistair and Tiff, over to you.
Thanks, Lou.
Thanks, Lou.
I'll get us kicked off today as we take a look at this research paper. Thanks, Lou, for organizing the webinar. Alistair and I have been really excited to share this think piece with you. It's been a really big project. We're thrilled that it's ready to go. I believe you'll be able, we'll send out the paper after this workshop, and we'll also have it online soon if it's not quite there yet, but it will be soon. Well, Alistair and I will be discussing the key findings in this paper. I want to acknowledge our treaty partners, Tiwaka Kaiora, and the work that Dr. Jessica Hutchings and Joe Smith did on this paper as well. Jessica and Joe really dove into the approaches of traditional Maori organic knowledge being adopted by MPI at the moment in the development of the National Organic Standard, and looking at some of the risks that these approaches hold on Indigenous knowledge. And it's a fascinating case study, and I encourage you to all read the paper that includes their pieces that looks into indigeneity and free trade agreements, and how we look at the contradictions of the spirit of these agreements versus the actual rules that are written in the processes that are behind that. So please take a look at the paper for that. Alistair and I won't be speaking on behalf of Jessica and Joe, but we'd love to bring them on for a separate session, separate, lunch and learn like we have every month to talk about their pieces, because it's really important. So make sure you catch up with the rest of the paper so you can get all the details. Alistair, do you mind changing to the next?
Let's go. Hold on. There you go.
Oh, so our Land and Water National Science Challenge put out a call to answer these questions. Alistair and I were talking, and we were talking to Viv Williams as well, who's on this call, which is great to see. Viv was the old CEO of OANZ, so thanks for joining us, Viv. So we thought it would be a really important questions to answer on behalf of the organic sector to understand what might be affecting us, and also what opportunities this might bring. And so after reading these two questions, we immediately thought of the European Union. Next slide, please.
Yep. Oh, there we go.
There we go. So this is the title of our paper, EU Green Deal Impact on New Zealand's Land-Based Primary Producers, Supporting the Development of a Primarily Economic Rationale for a Transition to Move Environmentally Friendly or Environmentally Responsible Production Processes, including organic production, in New Zealand's major export-oriented primary sectors. And now, I guess we focus on the EU because we'd argue that no one in the world is legislating as in-depthly or as quickly to help change the course of climate, biodiversity, pollution, and consumer welfare as the European Union. Can you please hit the next slide?
No, there we go.
So many of you have heard of the EU Green Deal. It's a strategic framework for the EU to reach its climate neutrality goals across all facets of the economy by 2050. So not just agriculture, it's the entire economy. It's pretty incredible. And what most people don't know is just how robust and integrated the web of policies that are supporting the EU Green Deal are. And most people aren't really aware of the policies that are most likely going to affect them. So we specifically asked, how will the EU Green Deal affect New Zealand's land-based primary producers? What role does organics play? What are the overall risks? Next slide, please. So one of the first things we learned in our research was just how intricate these web of policies are that support the Green Deal. So there are multiple strategies and action plans that reinforce and reiterate specific goals across many policies. So it was these strategies that you have here in front of you and plans that is where we found several risks to New Zealand land-based producers. Now, I just want to clarify, we're not just talking only about organic producers, we're talking about all land-based primary producers. And the strategies and plans that we found were the farm to fork strategy, which is primarily agricultural based, the biodiversity strategy, the zero pollution action plan, the bioeconomy strategy, and the circular economy action plan. All of these are very specific, very detailed strategies and plans for how to mitigate the climate crisis. Slide number 6, please.
And they also have, each of them has a whole bunch of other strategies and plans and policy instruments sitting behind it. So, these are the ones that we identified as being the most relevant, but there's a whole suite that sits around and alongside these that. So as Tiffany says, it's incredibly intricate and incredibly interlocking in terms of how their policy development process is happening.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And it's a good segue to this next slide, because we could take a look at, let's say this is sort of a sales pitch that the EU uses to help identify some of the lead programs that are part of the farm to fork strategy. If you look at the goals, for the farm to fork strategy, we're looking at 50% overall reduction in pesticides, especially 50% of reduction of the chemicals, the most hazardous chemicals, substances and pesticides. We're looking at 50% reduction in nutrient losses while retaining soil fertility, 20% less fertilizer use, reducing the sales of antimicrobials by 50% for farmed animals in aquaculture. And one of the biggest things for our sector, for the organic sector, is looking at the goal of increasing the percentage of organic farming in the EU to 25%. Next slide, please. Oh, just go back one more.
Oh, one more, sorry. Oh, there we go, sorry.
There we go. So if we're looking at, for example, the soil strategy, these are all of the other strategies that the soil strategy is basically a part of, or that they touch in terms of the policy web that we are describing. So some of the goals, for instance, in the EU farm to fork, you've got the goal of decreasing pesticides. It's also the same exact goals of 50% reduction in pesticide use is also the same goal in the soil strategy. It's the same goal in the zero pollution action plan, and it's the same goal in the biodiversity strategy. So what this essentially means is that the EU is using a very integrated approach to policymaking. It's utilizing this approach in order to create policies that align with the overall goals and objectives of the European Council, which is made up of members from the 27 member states across the EU member states. So if you hit the next slide, sometimes I get questions about, how does the EU, the overall EU plans get integrated on the ground in a single member state or in a single country like Germany. So for the instance in agriculture, you've got the top level European Council develop policies and strategies and goals that make up the Green Deal. In the case of agriculture, that's carried down to the common agricultural policies, and that's further pushed into each member country, then negotiating the terms of that CAP or those CAP policies, those common agricultural policies. They negotiate the terms with the council, and then from there, that each member state or each member country develops a national plan, which is then enforcing that overall Green Deal. So it's quite high level that we're talking about EU Green Deal, and New Zealand. But really, it goes down to each of those member states. So that's carried through all the way to actionable plans on the ground. So for example, the 25% organic farming goal is an EU-wide goal. Not every country is going to have 25% of its agricultural output as organic. Some countries will have more, some will have less. But that's how each member state then negotiates this with the European Council. So I just wanted to throw that in because sometimes it helps develop the mindset of how this gets enforced on the ground. So let's look at some of the key policies that we think are going to affect land-based primary producers in New Zealand. The first one is the ban on the importation into the EU of products containing residues of pesticides and agrochemicals banned in the EU. So this means that if a pesticide is not allowed to be used in the EU, products that are containing any residues of that pesticides or that substance will not be allowed to enter the border. So right now we're looking at the list of banned pesticides in the EU. There's 195 banned pesticides. Right now in New Zealand, our list of banned pesticides is only 27. Not to say that every single one of those banned pesticides is being used in New Zealand, but it does show you the difference in how we're legislating in New Zealand against harmful substances and pesticides that aren't equivalent with some of our key markets. And I actually think that's one area that New Zealand and the EPA could probably focus on a little bit to clean up so that we don't have such a despairing list between the two. When people look under the hood like we do, it doesn't look great for New Zealand to have such a wide difference of banned substances. So perhaps cleaning that up will help New Zealand a little bit. The second one that I want to talk about is the ban on the importation of products associated with deforestation. So this means that products associated with deforestation before 31st of December 2020 will not be allowed to enter the EU. This is extended through the entire supply chain. So if you feed cattle imported palm kernel that can be traced back to deforestation, you will not be allowed to sell your beef in the EU. There's a current cap on the number of sectors that this covers, but that will continue to expand. The next one is legislation aimed at eliminating greenwashing. This means that New Zealand producers are going to have to prove that their product or brand truly accomplishes the attributes it's marketing. So terms like regenerative or climate friendly or zero carbon, they all have to be substantiated with significant evidence, and not just for part of the product, but the entire production and supply chain of that product. So if you are going to go the zero carbon or the low carbon or climate friendly, you're really going to have to make sure you have assurance that's backing up exactly that claim through the entire supply chain. And the last one is the biggest risk that we found is a sustainable labeling scheme that's been developed that will require every product sold in the EU to be evaluated and ranked by its total performance in climate mitigation, water, air, soil quality, biodiversity conservation, and circular economy. Every product sold will be graded on its performance. And again, it'll be graded on its performance across the supply chain. So it's not just your production, it's how you're getting, let's say you're producing wine. You can produce organic wine, you put it in a bottle. Your bottle is really, really heavy. It's going to be a lot of climate miles or food miles to get that product into market. What do you do to offset the carbon that's calculated in the transportation of that product? So these are things that we have to start really planning for as a sector, and as a country.
And the important point there is that, as Tiff says, this is not just about the product or the production that is controlled in-house. It extends backwards into the supply chain and forwards into the transportation chain. And, so the entire value chain of products that end up being imported into the EU or manufactured in the EU, because it will apply to their own manufacturing domestically as well, will need to be able to substantiate and quantify the performance of the product against these metrics.
Yeah, it's really interesting too. Thanks, Alistair. That in terms of circular economy, the EU is streamlining recycling across all 27 member states. We've already seen changes to computer cords and cell phone cords. Charging cords are now going to be streamlined. You don't need 15 different varieties for different phones. We're going to cut down on the electronic waste. So just like that, they're streamlining recycling. So not everything that is recyclable today in the EU will be recyclable tomorrow. So you have to make sure your packaging is in line with their circular economy initiatives for recycling. Again, across the entire economy. So it's a bit complex, but it's astonishing what they're achieving in such a short time. So next slide, please. So let's talk about why this matters and where organics fits into this. We know that the EU is utilizing trade to support the significant changes that's making its domestic sustainable agenda. The EU is the world's largest trading bloc, so that what the EU decides at the border really has profound impacts on how the world does business. And I think we need to make sure that we're talking about things in trade terms too, because we understand that the EU is doing this because it's leveling up towards its climate initiatives, but it's sort of bringing the world kicking and screaming with it, because it's saying we're going to protect our domestic industries. If they're going to work harder to make things more climate efficient, we're protecting those industries so they don't get destroyed by imports that are not climate friendly or that are heavy in pollution producers. And so by doing that, and by utilizing trade to make these changes, they're helping the world sort of level up. Where we actually get to in all of our negotiations with everyone, because every single country in the world right now is trying to figure out how do we deal with the EU? What do we need to do to stay relevant in their marketplace? They're obviously a powerhouse in terms of consumption for products around the world, but in doing that, how do we protect our own domestic industries? And I know Alistair can talk about that a little bit later too. One thing that the EU does with the 25%, the push for 25% organic farming across the EU, in the EU's national organic standards, they recognize organics as public good. So beyond just the income that a producer gets from growing organic produce or farming organically, they recognize the intrinsic value to the rest of the country with the clean green production that it's actually creating, with the increase or enhancement in protection of biodiversity, with the reduction of agrochemicals, with the reduction of fertilizers, with the reduction of pollution. So there is value in organics in the EU, and the EU consumer is starting to really expect that in the marketplace. So what's happening is we've got a very conscious consumer that's becoming more and more conscious as time goes by, because the government's enacting policies that are helping the consumers make clean, green, decisions on the products that they're buying. They're letting them vote with their dollar, and they're creating policies that help enforce that. And Alistair, do you want to?
Yeah, sure.
Take it from here.
Okay. So as we, some of this we've already touched on, the fact that the EU deliberately exports its domestic policies to its trading partners. And in our case, when we looked at the text of the free trade agreement, all of the things that TIFF has gone through are represented in some way, shape, or form in the text of the New Zealand EU free trade agreement. The other issue is that, we can, in certain industries, people say, well, the EU is not a big market for us. But the danger is that, under, equal treatment principles in international trade, that these policies get spread into other major trading blocs. It would be a real concern for New Zealand if China started enacting similar measures, or the US started enacting similar measures. And in some ways that is almost inevitable, because these policies will be weaponized, for want of a better word, by other major importing nations in order to keep their industries competitive and meet the standards that the move along the path that the EU is blazing. The one thing we haven't mentioned is carbon border adjustment mechanisms. Now, there's a lot of talk about that. In this space, it is a very difficult thing to implement because agriculture in the EU doesn't currently fall under the EU emissions trading scheme. But the trade experts that we spoke to, they are firmly of the opinion that at some point that will change, and carbon border adjustment mechanisms in the agricultural sectors, primary sectors, will become feasible. And the EU is likely to be, again, the pioneer in that space. That will probably form part of the next revision of the EU Common Agricultural Policy. So yeah, and again, as Tiffany pointed out, in a few areas, New Zealand's domestic policies are less rigorous than comparable ones in the EU. The pesticide example, the greenwashing example, we did a deep dive into what is New Zealand's domestic policy regime in all these areas, and then overlaid that with, as I said, with the text of the New Zealand EU Free Trade Agreement. So the upshot of it is that despite the fact that we have a free trade agreement with the EU, there's a real risk of for New Zealand producers of maintaining or expanding their market access in the EU, despite the fact that we have this free trade agreement. And one of the things that we found is that organic production can mitigate a lot of these risks. What we did as the last element of the paper was we engaged a trade analysis expert. It's an academic think tank that's one of the 14 one of the 14 WTO chairs scattered around the world at different universities. So this university, they have a commercial arm that does this kind of trade research, and the company's called Trade Advisory. So they did some modeling for us of what is the potential for New Zealand exports and for New Zealand exports in the context of increasing conversion of European demand from conventional to organic. So basically, our case study sectors that we decided on, because they're A, they're relevant, and B, we had good data for them, were wine and dairy. And the conclusion was that, generally speaking, there's a huge amount of potential for additional exports from New Zealand, and particularly organic exports, as those preferences in the EU change. So just, the methodology is massively complicated, so I'm not going to get into it. But effectively, this is an example of what we found. So New Zealand, EU's total imports of bottled wine in 2021 was the equivalent of 12 billion New Zealand dollars. The bottled wine imports from New Zealand was 150 million New Zealand dollars. So fairly small in the context of the EU's total imports. Then we did a bit of modeling to say, well, of that of that total EU import demand, if 10% of it was converted to organic demand, what would that mean? Well, then the value of roughly the untapped potential for organic wine imported into the EU would be almost the same as what New Zealand's total exports to the EU at the moment are. So, this is only a demand side analysis. It doesn't look at whether New Zealand or any other country can supply that demand, but that is the modeled increase in demand for organic production. And we did the same with dairy. This was whole milk powder. Again, New Zealand's imports into the EU is tiny compared to total imports, but that's also a function of how distorted the EU market and the EU Common Agricultural Policy makes the EU market. But in this case, we could actually, the untapped potential is more than, almost twice New Zealand's current exports into the EU. Now, this was just a little bit of a quick exercise to see what the implications of that conversion of EU demand in to organic might mean. And as I say, we modeled it at 1%, 5%, and 10% of total EU imports, just to give us a sense of what the potential might be. But, as I say, it's staggering that in some cases, the untapped demand just for organics in the EU is greater than New Zealand's total exports of both conventional and organic into the EU. So yeah, I think that's all I have to say about the modeling piece. Tiff, you wanted to talk about the organic numbers?
Yeah. So we know that the worldwide organic market is growing, and I just wanted to touch base a little bit as we in this presentation soon to answer your questions. Is where's the organic market going worldwide? So in Australia, we're at $2.2 billion. Next slide.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay.
Oh,
yeah, in the UK, we've got it 6.2 billion. The US and the European Union, roughly, the United States is the largest organic market at a little over 100 billion New Zealand dollars. The European Union follows the second place in $100 billion. And then next slide, the global organic market right now is worth 300 billion New Zealand dollars. What's crazy is that this is growing over 13% a year worldwide. And we're expected to reach $900 billion market by 2030. So this, again, the importance of the dynamics of the EU, the policy making that they're creating, that's going to step things up in terms of requiring assurance to make sure that you meet the absolute goals of what your product is selling, so that consumers have transparency around what they can expect. And certified organics, with the EU being pretty much in love with organics in a way that helps us be able to grab some of the market share there. It's also going to be reflected worldwide. And so we're seeing potential growth, over 13% over the next, 8 years. And it's absolutely incredible opportunity for New Zealand producers to take advantage of this marketplace. I'm going to leave us there because I think you'll probably have some questions. And thank you very much. You guys are such a quiet bunch. If you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll try to find you. You're all blown away.
We've just got a comment from saying thanks for the great presentation.
Oh, okay.
Thanks, Murph.
Are there any comments? Questions?
Feel free to unmute and ask any questions.
I just want to say, wow.
Who's that?
Thanks.
That's Molly. Sorry.
Oh, Molly. Hi.
Molly from Roots and Shoots.
Yep.
Hi, Molly.
Sorry for interrupting.
I don't know. It's good. Wow. And like the numbers and the whoa.
Wow. Yay.
Yay. Yay is right. There's great opportunities ahead of us. It's going to take us work to get there, but I think we've got a good case for moving things forward. Absolutely.
I see Angela's put a question in the chat about do the deforestation rules apply to the dairy sector? Angela, the answer at the moment is no. It applies to beef, cocoa, various other products, but not to dairy at the moment. But as Tiffany said, given the ambition of the EU, that list is only going to grow. That list of industries to which these deforestation rules will apply in the future is only going to grow.
And dairy is really important because New Zealand's the largest PKE importer in the world.
Yep.
And making sure that all of that and the soy that we get usually from Argentina is not aligned with, connected with deforestation will be really, really important. That's already a requirement in organics. Deforestation is part of the organic standard, but for those not in organics, that'll be absolutely critical.
Viv Williams is asking, or she's saying, thank you for the excellent presentation. Have you guys shared this with the government, and what was their response?
We've shared bits and pieces. I have another conversation with a couple ministers next week, which a lot of this data will come back to. We've sent it to other ministers, and we're getting some good response. It's a crazy time in government right now with the election. But we'll keep on it.
And Adam Tyson's asking, for the chemical residue piece, will there be requirements for organic producers to supply testing results for the chemicals listed?
I am not sure. I mean, the certified organics will have, there'll be reciprocity agreements with countries that accept organic producers, exporting, or certified organic producers exporting into that country, into the EU. So that there'll be a reciprocity. We're still going through the national organic standard and developing the regime here in New Zealand. So in terms of infringement and enforcement, I'm not quite sure where we're going to land, but I'm assuming that you're not going to have residue testing for all the products that are organic because they will be banned.
And I mean, I think, Tiff, maybe it's, an related point is the window and the time frame for the negotiation of equivalency with the EU is important here. So there is the EU is going through a process of negotiating equivalency with its trading partners around organic standards. So, that means that at some point, should that negotiation proceed as planned, and there not be any delays in terms of what Tiff said about the development of the New Zealand organic standard following the passage of the bill a few months ago. The reality is that there should be, if you are certified organic in New Zealand, you will therefore be, have an equivalency with the EU organic standard, and therefore whatever rules the EU applies to its own domestic organic production will also apply. It only partially answers Adam's question because we don't know what that regime is going to shake out like. But the aim is certainly that there will be equivalency.
Charles, your question says, beyond the aim of 25% organic and pesticide reduction, the CAP farm to fork, can you comment on some of the wider aims? CAP reform is always a fun time in Europe. There is there'll be a lot of biodiversity initiatives. There's a lot in the biodiversity plan about pollution and the protection of species and the enhancement of biodiversity on farms. I'll send you the paper so you can read all about it. There's quite a significant amount that goes into CAP reform. Farmer payments go into CAP reform, subsidies are in the CAP reform, protecting food and the quality of health is getting updated in the CAP reforms. There's a whole digitalization piece of across the EU in terms of from agriculture beyond that goes into CAP reform. So it's quite extensive what's happening after 2026 2027, there'll be a whole new sort of cap that we know of. If Vivian, currently organic certified kiwi fruit is tested for chemicals with zero residue allowed. Great, thanks, Vivian. And the fantastic information that is well worth being part of New Zealand's food industry transformation plan, which is export focused and MPI led. Agreed. We need to get this over to them as well. Any other questions or comments?
Now we've got John asking, there are noises coming from Europe that Olsen-P levels over 20 will become illegal. Is there any indication to date that will be imposed for overseas agricultural imports?
Yeah, so a lot of these pesticide residue, the reduction of pesticides and some of the banning of more pesticides will come into effect by 2030.
And again, you know, under the equal treatment principles, if it becomes illegal domestically, it is by definition will be included in whatever border measures the party involved applies.
Sorry, it's a soil phosphorus test, not a pesticide. Sorry, no, I was looking at pesticides. Is there any noise around non-GMO within the EU? There is noise about the EU potentially changing and allowing some types of GM or GE into the EU. Are you talking about non-GMO within organics or just
in general, I suppose?
Yeah, there's quite a few organizations that are not fond of GMOs, you know, being allowed in Europe. Where they get to with that, I'm not quite sure. It's all brewing everywhere across the, you know, New Zealand and the EU at the moment, and the US has been in the fight for that for quite some time.
Molly's saying yes, and even though as we suppliers to kiwi fruit, we must again have all of our organic inputs tested for these residues at great cost, even though these products are certified under BioGrow.
Yeah, so with the new organic regime, again, what the rules are around that, because it's country to country with the government-backed regulation, things might change a little bit. So when we'll be working with MPI on some of these rules and the regulations here pretty soon.
Okay, any more questions from participants?
I also wanted to just chime in here and say, you know, glyphosate is another substance that is constantly in debate in the EU, and the use of glyphosate and what that means for Europe. So normally, if an agrochemical gets approved, it has 10 or 15 years that's available in the market before it has to come back up for reevaluation. Glyphosate is getting kicked down the road like every year now, because people want to talk about it, but they also don't want to talk about it. They don't know what the replacement of glyphosate can be. So at the end of this year, they will have, the European Council will have a vote on whether glyphosate will be one of those banned substances, or if it'll be a phase out within a certain period of time, or if it'll be allowed for maybe another 5 years. So we're eager to understand where the EU is placing glyphosate use at the moment as well. Lots of changes. That's basically what we're in for. So it's quite, you know, being abreast of this is quite significant for the sector. Again, looking at how these rules are going to affect us, especially with climate miles, especially with, you know, in transportation, looking at our, you know, the value of organics across the entire supply chain, looking at our packaging materials. How do we lower our carbon footprint of organic materials? The production end of it will be really important because we'll have organic, you know, certification and assurance there for consumers. And this mitigates a lot of the issues that the EU is trying to change through these regulations. But at the same time, how do we look at our entire supply chain so that we meet the expectations of the EU? And I think we need to continue this work as a sector. All right. If no one has any other questions, I think we'll end it there.
Thanks, everyone. I will make sure the recording goes online early next week, and I'll also put a download to Tiffany and Alistair's report, their paper. I'll send out the link.
Oh, let's see what Jason's saying.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tiff. Thanks, Alistair. Lots of thanks coming through in the chat. I'm going to end the session, Tiff, the recording.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.